I signed the papers before I understood what they meant. Not the marriage certificate, the other papers, the ones with the non-disclosure clause buried on page 47, paragraph 3, subsection B. The clause that said if I ever told anyone what really happened inside that penthouse, I would lose everything. And I mean everything. The apartment, the settlement, my sister's medical coverage. My silence had a price tag, and he knew exactly what it was worth. But I'm telling you anyway, because some stories are too dangerous to keep. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that 8 months ago, I walked into the lobby of Mercer Tower wearing a blazer I'd ironed 3 times and shoes that were already giving me blisters, and I had exactly one goal: survive the interview. I did not survive. I mean, I got the job, but something else happened in that building. Something that started as a transaction and turned into the most psychologically disorienting experience of my adult life. And the worst part? Part of me still isn't sorry. Let me take you back, not to the beginning is boring. Let me take you to the moment I should have turned around and walked out. It was my 3rd week working as executive assistant to Callum Mercer. 34 years old, net worth somewhere north of $4 billion, face like a Renaissance sculpture that had developed a bad attitude. I'd been warned about him before I started. Everyone warned me about him. He doesn't keep assistants, the HR woman told me, smiling too wide. You'll understand once you start. I thought that meant he was difficult. I had no idea what difficult actually looked like. 3rd week, I was delivering a contract to his private conference room, 42nd floor, no windows on the interior walls, that particular kind of silence that feels pressurized, when I overheard him on the phone. I wasn't eavesdropping, the door was ajar, he didn't hear me approach, and what I heard him say stopped every single function in my body. She doesn't need to know the real reason, she just needs to say yes. She. I stood there in the hallway, contract folders pressed to my chest, and my brain started doing that thing where it offers you 2 explanations, the innocent one and the terrifying one, and desperately tries to pick the innocent one. Maybe he was talking about a client, a business deal, a contract negotiation. He was not talking about a client. I should tell you something about Callum Mercer before we go further, because he is not the villain of this story in the way you're expecting, and that is precisely what makes him so dangerous. He was meticulous, not cruel, meticulous. There's a difference, and it took me too long to learn it. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't throw things, he simply engineered situations with the cold precision of someone who had studied people long enough to know exactly which lever to pull. He drank the same black coffee every morning, no sugar, burnt tasting, from a machine in his private office that cost more than my monthly rent. He wore a watch that was so understated it looped back around to obscene. He had a habit of pausing for exactly 3 seconds before answering any question, like he was running your words through some internal processor. After 2 weeks, I started counting those pauses. After 3 weeks, I realized I was looking for them. That should have told me something. The call I'd overheard was a Tuesday. By Thursday, I found out who she was. Her name was Isabel Crane, 26 years old, daughter of Martin Crane, the man whose shipping empire Callum had been trying to acquire for the better part of 3 years. Martin Crane was old money, deeply principled, deeply stubborn, and deeply unimpressed with Callum Mercer's offers. I prepared the file. I read it, and then I sat at my desk with the particular feeling of someone who has just found a second body in a story they thought only had one. Because here's what the file told me. Martin Crane had one condition that had never wavered across 3 years of failed negotiations. One condition that was documented, laughed about, and ultimately dismissed by every analyst in Callum's acquisition team. He would only merge with a man he considered family. Old-fashioned, I know, but Martin Crane was 71, built his company with handshakes, and didn't care what anyone thought about it. And Callum Mercer? Callum Mercer had just started the process of becoming family. I put the file down. I picked up my phone. I put my phone down. I sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, and then I did something that I still, to this day, cannot fully explain. I kept the file, and I started my own. If you're still with me right now, and I think you are because you're not the kind of person who walks away from a story mid-sentence, then you already sense what I sensed in that moment. This wasn't just a business acquisition.
This was a transaction, a human one, and someone hadn't been told the terms. Here is where it gets complicated. Here is where I need you to stay with me, because the easy thing, the comfortable thing, would be to make Callum Mercer simply a monster, to give you a clean villain with clean motivations and a clean resolution. But that is not what happened. What happened was this. 6 weeks into my employment, Callum called me into his office at 6:47 in the evening. I know because I'd been watching the clock, desperate to leave, my feet still punishing me for the shoes, and he looked at me across his desk for one of those 3-second pauses and said, "I need you to attend a dinner tomorrow night as my guest. Not my assistant, not a colleague, my guest." I said, "I'm sorry?" He said, "Martin Crane will be there, his daughter, 12 other people. I need someone beside me who isn't a lawyer or a sycophant. You qualify." That was the compliment. You qualify. Somehow, from him, in that flat, declarative tone, it landed differently than it should have. I told him I'd think about it. He said, "I'll have a car here at 7 tomorrow," and looked back at his screen. The decision, apparently, had already been made. I went home. I called my sister. I did not tell her the full story. I couldn't yet. I didn't have it. But I told her I thought my boss might be doing something that wasn't right. She said, "Is he breaking the law?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Then go to the dinner, find out." My sister has always been more pragmatic than me, partially by nature, partially because she's been dealing with a chronic illness since she was 19, and pragmatism became survival. Her medical bills were the reason I'd taken a job I was technically overqualified for. Her medical bills were the reason I stayed. That detail matters. Remember it. Remember it. The dinner was at a place that didn't have a sign outside. The kind of restaurant that doesn't need one. The kind where the lighting exists at one precise, flattering frequency, and the bread arrives in linen. Isabel Crane was already there when we arrived, and here is the first thing you need to understand about Isabel. She was not what I expected. Not fragile, not naive, not some decorative heiress unaware of the game being played around her. She was sharp, funny in a dry, quiet way. She had her father's directness and something else underneath, something watchful, an alertness that she wore like a second skin. She shook my hand and held it for half a second longer than necessary, looking at me with an expression I couldn't parse. Later, I would understand what that expression was. She was trying to figure out if I knew. Callum was different at that dinner. Not warm, exactly, but permeable, like he'd switched off one layer of architecture. He made Martin Crane laugh twice, genuinely, not the polite laugh of someone being managed. He listened. He asked questions that had actual curiosity behind them. And here is the part I did not expect, the part that cracked something small and hairline in my certainty. He was good at it. Not performing. Good. The kind of good that only comes from real intelligence or real practice, and I wasn't yet sure which. I watched him all night from the corner of my eye, the way you watch something that might be dangerous, and I felt, against my will, against my better judgment, against everything I had already decided to believe about him, I felt confused. And that made me angrier than anything else. If you're still here, and something tells me you are, then I want you to know this is the part of the story where most people's instincts fail them, including mine. Because what happened over the next 3 weeks made the whole picture blur. Callum started including me in meetings I had no business attending, strategy sessions, calls with his legal team. Once, a 40-minute conversation with a therapist he apparently saw every 2 weeks, which he seemed to have completely forgotten I was present for, and which I sat through in a suspended disbelief, hearing a man I had categorized as a chess player say in a careful voice, "I think I engineered this to avoid feeling anything real, and I don't know how to stop." I never mentioned it. He never mentioned it. But after that, the 3-second pauses got longer. And then, the dinner happened. Not the restaurant, a different one, a private one. Callum called me at 8 in the evening on a Wednesday and asked if I'd eaten. I said no, which was true. I'd been working late. He said, "There's food in the conference kitchen. Come up." The 42nd floor at 8 p.m. is a different place than the 42nd floor at 9 a.m., The city beneath it looks different. The air pressure feels different. Even the silence has a different texture. Less professional, more honest. He'd ordered from somewhere that definitely didn't deliver, and yet here was the food, on actual plates, on the conference table I usually covered in legal briefs. We ate. He talked. Not about the acquisition, not about Martin Crane, not about Isabel. He talked about his father, about growing up in a house where money was both the solution to every problem and the source of all of them. He said, "That's why I'm good at what I do, and it's probably why I'm not good at anything else." And I made the critical mistake of this entire story. I believed him. Now, here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Callum Mercer had done this before. Not identically, but the pattern, the access, the unusual intimacy, the after-hours conversation, it was documented by 2 previous assistants, neither of whom signed an NDA that stuck because he'd been smarter by the time he got to me. I found this out from his former head of legal, a woman named Patricia Ossie, who left the company 14 months before I arrived, and who, when I eventually tracked her down, said 6 words to me through a barely opened hotel room door. He knows exactly what he's doing. Then she closed the door, and I stood in that hallway for a very long time. Let me tell you about the proposal. Not to me, to Isabel. Because that happened at week 11, and I knew it was coming. I'd watched the machinery move into place over months, 1 gear at a time, but knowing doesn't inoculate you against the thing itself. He proposed at a private event that I had organized, that I had planned the logistics for. The venue, the guest list, the flowers, pale ivory roses, Isabel's favorite, which I had found in a notes app she'd left open on a shared tablet at a prior event, and noted, because I note everything.
He used those details to make it feel personal. Details I had given him. Details he had used. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She was in love with him by then. I know because I'd watched that happen too. Here's what I haven't told you yet. Here's the part that changed everything. 3 days after the engagement, while Callum was in Geneva and Isabel was presumably planning a future, Isabel called the office directly, asked for me specifically. We'd spoken a handful of times, professional contexts. She was always kind to me in the way that people who were raised right are kind to everyone, with no gradient of importance. She said, "Can we have coffee, off the record?" I said yes. I should not have said yes. But I did. She knew. Not everything, but enough. She'd overheard a phone call, a different one than mine, but the same architecture, the same cold language of strategy. She'd heard the name of her father's company. She'd heard a number, a valuation. She looked at me across that coffee and said, "I need to know if you know." And here is the moment that defines this entire story. Here is the moment I still turn over in my hands at 3 a.m. I could have lied. I could have protected my job, my income, my sister's medical coverage, which was directly tied to my employment benefits package. I could have given Callum Mercer what he had, perhaps without meaning to, trained me to give him: my silence. Instead, I said, "What do you already know?" And she told me, and then I told her. And then we sat there in that coffee shop for 27 minutes, 2 women inside a story that neither of us had consented to, trying to figure out what came next. What came next was Callum. Not in the coffee shop, he was still in Geneva, but his presence arrived in the form of a phone call to me at 11:42 that night. He said, "I need to ask you something directly." I said, "All right." He said, "Did you meet with Isabel today?" And I made my second critical mistake. Not lying, not yet, just hesitating. 1 single second. That was enough. He arrived back from Geneva the next morning. I know because I booked his flight. I knew the arrival time. What I didn't know, what I was not prepared for, was that he would come directly from the airport to the office, bypass reception, bypass his personal assistant's desk, and appear in the doorway of the small office they'd given me, like a weather system that had learned to wear suits. He closed the door. He sat across from me. He did the 3-second pause, and then he said something that I had not prepared any version of myself to hear. He said, "I think I made a mistake." I said nothing. I was very busy not saying nothing in a way that looked nothing. He said, "Not you, don't flatter yourself." He said it without heat, almost with the opposite of heat. The whole thing. I think it got away from me. I said, "What got away from you?" He said, "What I wanted." You are somewhere past the 20-minute mark of this story, and I need you to hear what I'm about to say very carefully, because this is the part that the first version of me, the version who walked into that lobby in blistered shoes, would not have believed. What I felt in that moment was not triumph, not vindication. What I felt was something I didn't have vocabulary for until much later. I felt like the architecture of the whole thing had just shifted, like a building you'd assumed was stone turned out to be something else, something with the capacity to move, and I didn't know if that was more dangerous or less. Isabel, when I told him what he'd said, was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Do you believe him?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "That's interesting, because I think I do, and I'm the one he was using." This was what made Isabel Crane remarkable, and I don't use that word loosely. She said, "Here's what I know. My father's company deserves a real future. Callum's the only person in 3 years who's actually understood what it needs. The deal itself isn't the problem. I'm the problem, or rather what he was using me for." She paused. Then she said, "What if I decided those were 2 different things?" What followed was 6 weeks that I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe accurately. Here is what I know for certain. Isabel went to her father. She told him a version of the truth, edited, strategic, but true. She told him she wanted to understand the deal on its own terms, independent of her. She told him she'd been introduced to Callum Mercer as a person first, and that she'd formed opinions, and those opinions were her own. Martin Crane, to his credit, listened. He asked for 60 days of renegotiation with Isabel present in the room. Callum agreed, without hesitation, without a counteroffer. That, the absence of a counteroffer, was the first thing that made me look at him differently. The second thing was what he did about me. He could have fired me. Legally, he had grounds. I had shared information about his professional activities with a third party, even if that third party was the subject of those activities. His legal team made this point to him, apparently more than once. He didn't. Instead, he called me in on a Thursday afternoon and slid a document across the desk. Not a termination letter, a contract modification.
A raise, a formal title change, and a non-disclosure agreement that was the most elegant piece of legal weaponry I had ever seen, covering what I knew, what I'd shared, what I'd done, and ensuring my silence about all of it in perpetuity. He said, "You can have a lawyer review it. I'd recommend you do." I said, "What happens if I don't sign?" He said, "Then you don't sign." He said it like it was a complete sentence, like it didn't come with a threat trailing behind it. I couldn't find the threat. I looked for it for 3 days. I still haven't found it. My sister told me to sign. "They're giving you more than they took," she said. "That doesn't happen." She wasn't wrong. I signed on a Tuesday in his office. He didn't watch me sign. He stood at the window, looking out at the city the way he always did when he was thinking. And when I put the pen down, he said, without turning around, "For what it's worth, you were the only person in this building who saw it." I said, "That's not actually a compliment." He said, "No, it's an apology." I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't. The acquisition completed 5 weeks later. Martin Crane and Callum Mercer signed on a Thursday in a room I was not invited to. Isabel was there. The engagement, quietly, mutually, and without press release, ended approximately 2 weeks before that. Both parties, by all accounts, remained on good terms, whatever that means. I heard this from Isabel herself, who called me on a Sunday, which was unusual. She said, "It turns out I liked him, just not in the way either of us expected." I said, "What way was that?" She said, "As someone I could trust to tell me the truth when I asked for it directly, eventually." She said, "He said you're the reason for the eventually." And then she laughed and I laughed, and we talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with any of this. I should tell you what happened after, because here's what I realized about this story, and about the kind of stories you think you know, the billionaire and the assistant story, the arrangement that becomes something else story. Here's what I realized. The most dangerous part wasn't any of what I've described. The most dangerous part was quieter. The most dangerous part was the morning, 6 weeks after the acquisition closed, when Callum stopped by my office, which I now had, with a door and a view, and set a coffee on my desk. My coffee, the specific one, medium roast, oat milk, 1 sugar, the order I'd never told him, but that had started appearing every morning for the past 3 weeks, from a place 2 blocks over that definitely wasn't the office machine. He said nothing. He left, and I sat with that coffee and thought about a man who had planned an acquisition through a marriage, and who was currently expending the same precise attention he'd applied to a $4 billion business deal on learning my coffee order. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, an enormous thing, disguised as a small thing.
And that is when I became afraid in an entirely different way than I had been before. I'm not going to tell you what happened next, not because it isn't part of the story, but because what happened next is mine. It's the part I didn't sign away, the part that exists outside of the document on page 47, paragraph 3, subsection B. What I will tell you is this. There are people who study human beings the way other people study contracts, who learn the terms and find the leverage and close the deal, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes, they encounter something they didn't factor into the model, something that doesn't behave the way the data predicted. And in my experience, that is the most frightening moment of their lives, and mine. I signed the papers before I understood what they meant. But somewhere between the lobby and the 42nd floor, between the contract and the coffee, between the woman who ironed her blazer 3 times and whoever I am now, something shifted. Something that no NDA can describe. Something that even now, sitting here, telling you this, I'm still trying to name. If this story found something in you, some room you thought was locked, you're already the kind of person who needs the next one. It's waiting.